Tonight we will be celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Brooklyn for Peace. And we will be honoring the recipient of our Pathmakers to Peace Award, Professor Noam Chomsky. The question was, what is your assessment of Occupy Wall Street?
Well, I think the Occupy movement was an extremely important one. And it had the usual properties of American activist movements. It started with zero background, out of nowhere, just appealing to the mass sentiment that people have. No historical memory, no continuity, no institutional structure. In fact, it wasn't a movement, it was a tactic. Occupy is a tactic. It turned out to be a very good tactic. I mean, if somebody had asked me, is it worthwhile sitting in on Zuccotti Park, I'd say you're crazy. But it worked. And it went immediately, lit a spark all over the country, all over the world. And I taught at Occupy demonstrations in Sydney, Australia, in London, all over. It did light a spark, but it is a tactic. You can't sit in a place for very long. For one thing, people get annoyed. For another thing, you're under a foot of snow pretty soon. And you just can't repeat the same tactic over and over. It has to reach out to communities, to other actions, to integrate with other groups, and that's hard in the United States for the reasons I mentioned, because of the scattering of initiatives, the separation of people from one another. So the failure of Occupy is our problem. We have not created the structure that would have picked up that initiative and the excitement that grew out of it and turned it into an ongoing movement. And that's going to happen over and over.
What do you see as the strengths and weaknesses of the climate movement, and what is your assessment of what's been happening in Ferguson?
Well, let's start with the last. And what's happening in Ferguson is a reenactment of 500 years of American history. It goes back to 1619. Slaves were brought over, they were tortured, terrorized, and treated hideously. You want to know how they were treated? Take a look at this morning's New York Times. There's a very evocative article on ISIS and how it treated Yazidi prisoners. That's American history. That's the way our African American population was treated. Worse than that, in fact. And for a long period, in fact, as I said, there's only a few breaks in it. Militarization was one of the techniques of crushing the slave movement and everything that followed from it. Now it's incarceration and militarization of police. We're reenacting 500 years of American history. You have to understand that. And that's hard to deal with, but it has to be faced seriously. You can argue about the details of what happened in Ferguson, but the background and the general framework is hideously clear. It should be perfectly obvious to anyone who knows anything about American history. It's with us all the time. As far as the climate movement is concerned, it's like take the great march in New York, Manhattan, a couple 100,000 people in the streets protesting, demanding that something be done about the urgent problem of climate change. That was really important. What was the follow-up? That's the question. What do you do afterwards? The demonstrations make a lot of sense when they are part of ongoing movements. So take, say, the anti-Vietnam War movement. There were periodic demonstrations that individually they didn't do much, except encourage people to keep going on. But they were very important because they did send a signal to the power brokers, and they also encouraged the participants to do more. And they were doing lots of things. But that's the usual problem. We have to follow up on these things. Incidentally, the very day of the march in Manhattan, if you look at the press, there was a report from the International Climate Monitors that for the last year for which there was data, 2013, emissions had increased 2.3%. In the United States, 2.9%, reversing an earlier change. Same day, the Journal of the American Medical Association came out with a report estimating that the number of over 90-degree days in New York was going to triple in the next couple of years, with devastating effects in other parts of the world. Like in Bangladesh, it means hundreds of millions of people died when the war. All of this the same day as the climate march. Well, these things are going on. We have to have ways of dealing with them. And they're not trivial. Can be done. Now, there are countries that are doing things. Like Denmark, for example, is moving towards pretty near full sustainable energy. Germany, which is the most successful economy in the world by any measure, is moving substantially towards sustainable energy. We are undermining those efforts. You take a look at the business press again. One of the things they're exultant about is that now that the United States is producing a huge mass of cheap energy, we can undercut European manufacturing because we have lower costs. So we will drive them to back away from their efforts to create a world in which our grandchildren can survive. And that is reported with euphoria, right here, New York Times offices. These are serious civilizational and cultural problems which we've got to deal with.
I would say the question was what sorts of educational suggestions, guidelines would you offer for the younger generation coming up in light of the issues that we face, particularly climate?
Well, first of all, it's important to learn what's happening and to help others understand what's happening. And it's important to understand the impediments to doing anything. Just take a look at last week's election. Who is going to head the Senate Committee on the Environment? James Inhofe, one of the leading deniers that anything's happening. Incidentally, who's going to head the Senate Armed Services Committee? These are influential committees. Bomber McCain, whose solution to anything is bomb more. These are serious problems. And these moves are being made in opposition to the attitudes of the population, including the attitudes of the people who are voting for them. That's a major educational problem. I don't know if education is the right word. As I said, it means cultural and civilizational change. That's something that people have to work on. Things like that don't happen by themselves. There can be successes. In fact, there are major successes in recent years that we can learn from. So take, say, the last 50 years. I mean, in many ways, it's a more civilized country than it was, say, 50 years ago. So take my university, MIT. You walk down the halls of MIT when I got there in the 1950s, white males, well-dressed, jackets and ties, deferential, quiet, doing what they're supposed to do. Walk down the halls today, half women, third minorities, informal dress, which means informal relationships, lots of activism, signs all over the bulletin boards and so on. These things did not just happen by magic. The achievements of the feminist movement, which are quite significant, came from dedicated activism, starting with small consciousness-raising groups, extending to other things, actions, and so on. It worked substantially, not 100%, of course, a lot of attacks on it, regression, but real achievements, and that's the way everything else has been done too. There just is no other way. It's easy to say, hard to do, but there are no other lessons.
The question was, what is your perspective on Israel and Palestine conflict? And
the Jerusalem, Haram Sharif, the Islamic shrine where...
And the Islamic shrine in Jerusalem, the controversy surrounding that.
Well, the conflict over the Islamic shrine is just one of many. There's conflicts over confiscation of land, over settlement. The attack on Gaza, the last one, was the most savage and brutal of the series that have occurred. The next one will be worse. The conflict is not Israel-Palestine. Actually, I wrote a book right around when this organization was founded in 1983 called Fateful Triangle, U.S., Israel, Palestinians. That conflict persists largely because of us. As long as the United States, just take a look at the history. Again, it's kind of mostly suppressed, or you can find it easily. There is an overwhelming international consensus, includes just about everyone, on at least a short-term resolution of the immediate conflict. That's what's called a two-state settlement. The proposal is for two states on the internationally recognized border, so-called Green Line, with, I'm quoting it now, with guarantees for the security of each state and their right to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized borders. That's virtually the entire world. Actually, I'm quoting from a resolution brought to the Security Council in January 1976 by the three leading Arab states, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. It was vetoed by the United States. There was another one in 1980, same story. It goes right up to the present. I won't run through it. As long as the United States continues to provide the decisive economic, military, diplomatic support for Israeli actions, and also the ideological support in the way the issues are framed, understood, what's known, what isn't known. As long as this continues, there's no reason to expect Israel to back off from the policies it's pursuing. And you can see exactly what they are. They're not a secret. For the last 20 years, one major Israeli policy backed by the United States has been to separate Gaza from the West Bank. That's in violation of the Oslo Accords signed right at that time, which declared that they're territorial unity. And there's a reason for that. You look at a map, you can figure it out. Gaza offers the only opening to the outside world for any kind of Palestinian entity that might develop. If it's separated from the West Bank, any autonomy in the West Bank is in prison. So that's one policy. That Gaza is kept under a vicious siege, savage, brutal siege. The savagery is indescribable. Just a couple of days ago, we were talking about this, a Norwegian doctor, Mons Gilbert, very heroic doctor, who every time there's an attack on Gaza, he and a couple of others go to work in the Al-Shifa hospital, the main hospital. He's a trauma surgeon. And he's done amazing work. And he also describes what's happening. Israel just barred him from going to Gaza. Why? They don't want people to go there and put together the people they're destroying and tell the world about it. But that's one part. And that's going to continue as long as we back it. In the West Bank, what Israel's doing is very clear. It's taking over everything it finds of value, and you can see what it is. Big area around Jerusalem, much bigger than Jerusalem, greater Jerusalem. Corridors going to the east. There's one right to the east of Jerusalem, cuts all the way through practically to Jericho, bisects the West Bank. A lot of that was built under Clinton, clear purpose, bisecting the West Bank. A couple of other corridors up north, which bisect more areas, taking over the Jordan Valley, kicking out the inhabitants, building settlements. imprisons what's left, taking over everything within the so-called separation wall, which is of course illegal. And so like all of these actions are illegal, recognized to be illegal by the whole world. But they go on, and they'll go on as long as we back them. End result will be a kind of a greater Israel, including the areas I described, heavily settled. Very few Palestinians are either being driven out or to start with, and a couple of Palestinian cantons left. This is all in accord with the official policy of the governing party, the Likud party. Official program says there cannot be any Palestinian self-determination west of Jordan. Actually, if you look at their founding document way back, it says that what's contemporary Jordan is also part of the land of Israel. Well, that they can't quite manage. There's every reason to expect this to go on as long as you and I allow it. And that's what it comes down to. American policy is decisive in this respect. And there's no reason, it's not graven in stone. It can change. It's changed in other cases. Changed in the cases. Take South Africa, which people use as an analogy. The United States, Ronald Reagan, who was an extreme racist, was the last defender of apartheid. The whole world had turned against him. Reagan was actually overriding congressional vetoes. And when they were passed over his veto, he disregarded them anyway. The U.S. continued to support the terrorist army in Angola, the South African-backed terrorist army, even after South Africa backed off. And nobody else in the world was supporting it. The U.S. did finally change its policy. There are a lot of reasons for that. Go into it, but it did finally. And that apartheid ended. Not a marvelous solution by any means, but it's a victory. And there are other cases. This is an extremely powerful country. John Quincy Adams, 200 years ago, described the United States as a dangerous nation. Dangerous to anybody who's nearby. Obviously dangerous to the indigenous population, virtually exterminated. Dangerous to the slaves. Dangerous to Spanish Florida, which the U.S. conquered. Dangerous to Mexico. The U.S. conquered half of Mexico. That's why you have Spanish names in all the cities in California and Mexico and so on. Dangerous to Canada. The U.S. invaded Canada several times. It was beaten back by the British. Later on, it was dangerous to the Philippines, and Cuba, and Puerto Rico, and wherever it reached. It's a very powerful country, and power carries danger. It's also a very frightened country. Like, why, when the United States has, maybe 1,000 military bases around the world, they're all called defense. And for the American population, I think they're seen that way. We're defending ourselves. We're defending what we own, which is the world. We have the world, we've got to defend it. And if they come after us, we've got to stop them. This is often said straight out. Like, take Lyndon Johnson, he's kind of a man of the people, honest man of the people. He once gave a very interesting speech in Asia, I think it was 1966. He was speaking to American troops. And what he said was, he said, there's 150 million of us and 3 billion of them. And if might means right, they're going to sweep over us and take what we have. So we have to stop them in South Vietnam. That's deeply ingrained in American culture. And that's what the 1,000 bases are for. It's even in American rhetoric. So a major issue in American post-Second World War domestic policy is what's called the loss of China. Who is responsible for the loss of China? Now, that was the source of McCarthyism. Find people responsible for the loss of China. That when Kennedy was escalating in Vietnam, part of his concern was he might be blamed for the loss of Indochina. And we can't accept losses. Can I lose your computer? No, I can't. I could lose my computer, I can't lose yours. But it's just assumed that we own everything, so we might lose it, and it's threatened because all of them out there are coming after us. So we have to have this huge military machine. We have to intervene all over. We have to invade Grenada and Nicaragua, whatever it is. And these things are deeply rooted cultural properties. They go way back in American history. They're hard to dismantle. And there's a huge educational job to do so. Iran is described regularly by political leaders, by the press, as the greatest threat to world peace. It is. That's not what the world thinks. We know what we can find out what the world thinks, not by reading the American press, which doesn't report it. But last year there was a major poll, international poll by the Gallup polling agency, its British equivalent, in which one of the questions was, which country is the greatest threat to world peace? The United States, by a huge margin, and nobody else was even close. The second, way below, was Pakistan, and that was probably inflated by the Indian vote. Nobody else was mentioned. But that's the world opinion. Here, the greatest threat to world peace is Iran. Why? Well, basically because Iran isn't following American orders. Remember, it's now since 1953, that's 60 years. Not a day has passed that the United States hasn't been torturing Iran, literally. In 1953, there was a U.S.-run military coup that overthrew the parliamentary government, installed a brutal tyrant. He had a horrible human rights record. That went on until 1979. He was overthrown. And since then, Iran has been kind of independent, and that's not permitted. The U.S. immediately turned to supporting its friend Saddam Hussein, a great friend of Ronald Reagan and George Bush. And their attack on Iran, which was no small business, the U.S. provided aid, arms, other European countries provided materials for chemical weapons. The alliance was so close, the U.S. basically won the war for Iraq. The alliance was so close that in 1989, Bush and Bush 1, then president, actually invited Iraqi nuclear engineers to the United States for advanced training in weapons production. Okay? After that, various other things happened. The United States smashed up Iraq. Iran remains an enemy. It still is independent. The concern, allegedly, is that they might develop nuclear weapons. Well, U.S. intelligence has no information that they're developing nuclear weapons. They are developing nuclear power. Actually, that was under U.S. initiative. When Iran was under the Shah, our ally, the United States, that's Kissinger, Cheney, Rumsfeld, the rest of them, were pressuring Iran to develop nuclear power. My own institution, MIT, a big blow up on campus when it was discovered in the 70s that the MIT nuclear engineering department, under pressure from the government, was taking in Iranian nuclear engineers to train them in nuclear power development. Right now, no good anymore. They're an enemy. Actually, Kissinger was pretty honest and was asked by the press at one point, how come you supported Iraqi nuclear power in the 1970s, but you think it's the greatest threat to world peace now? He said, well, they were an ally then. Yeah, that's it. Is there a way to deal with the nuclear issue in Iran? Plenty of ways. Actually, one way was just announced a couple of days ago, repeating earlier proposals. They send out their low-enriched uranium to another country, and in return get isotopes that they need for their medical reactors. That was actually proposed by, there was an agreement in 2010 between Brazil, Turkey, and Iran exactly that. As soon as it was announced, the United States bitterly condemned Brazil for daring to do this. The Brazilian foreign minister was pretty upset by it. Cesar Amorim. He released a letter from Obama to President Lula of Brazil, in which Obama had actually proposed this, probably assuming that Iran wouldn't accept it. Well, that kind of went over like the usual lead balloon, but that was blocked. In 2012, December 2012, there was supposed to be a conference, an international conference in Helsinki, to take steps towards establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Very good move to carry forward overwhelming support for it in the world. It's advanced mostly by the Arab states. Israel refused to attend the conference. Then everyone was waiting to see what Iran would do. Iran said they would attend the conference with no preconditions. A couple of days later, the U.S. canceled the conference. That was not even reported in the United States. But there are plenty of ways to deal with this alleged greatest threat to world peace, but they're not being pursued. And the new Congress is going to make it a lot worse. The new Congress is the McCain line, just bomb everybody in sight. We got to make sure that Iran can't do anything unless we allow it. There is a proposal on the table right now, the Iran-Russia agreement. It does require that the United States lift sanctions, and that's probably what's going to hold it up. You'll see that in the next couple of weeks, Congress will probably refuse any move to reduce or eliminate the sanctions, which is, of course, the quid pro quo. And if they do, we'll squash that possibility. But again, those are not things that have to happen. If there's enough serious activism and protest here, that could change.